Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Coaching for Compassion, what research tells us about developing leaders who care. I'm Lucy Sullivan, and I'm your host with the MRG team. And just a few quick housekeeping things to get us started. I know everybody's been to lots of Zooms and lots of webinars, so this shouldn't be too surprising. First of all, we are recording today, and you'll get that recording. You'll also get the slides from the webinar. We also follow up with Q&A and a blog post with all the key takeaways. So there's a lot of good stuff coming in your inbox, so don't worry too much about furiously taking notes. We also welcome your questions. It's honestly one of our favorite parts of the webinar. So there's the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can drop things in there at any time. We'll stop just a couple times during the webinar for questions. We should have a good amount of time for that today. And we like to make sure you get answers. So if you don't get an answer to your question today, we do follow up directly. And we also include that Q&A in our blog post later, so you can check out other people's questions. There's a lot of really interesting angles and stimulating discussion. So you're on mute, your cameras are off. Our cameras will mostly be off as well, but we do want to hear from you. So don't feel like you need to wait for the breaks. Just keep those questions coming. So I'll be hosting today along with my colleague, Kayla Burnett, and let's see who else you'll be hearing from. So I'll speak to you a little bit to kick us off. I'm the head of marketing here. I kind of spearhead our communications effort as in our work on getting the word out about MRG's research and perspective and really getting that out to our global community. You'll also hear from Maria Brown, who's our head of research and education. Maria has an amazing passion for research and just a ceaseless curiosity. You may have heard her speak at events like Society for Consulting Psychologists, EMCC. She loves sharing our research and our findings, so we'll hear from her today. And you'll also hear from Trisha Nadav, who's the president of MRG. You may have seen her on a lot of our webinars. She's also spoken at ATD. She's done a TEDx talk. You may have seen Trisha around. She also loves to spread the word. She's been coaching, consulting, and doing leadership development for over 30 years herself in all kinds of roles within this industry and has a lot of great experience to share. And we're all from MRG. And if you don't know us, we're a global leader in designing assessments. We're focused on self-awareness and really making that long-term meaningful impact. We have solutions for leadership, which you'll hear a lot about today, and motivation, personal development, sales, all of these great things. With that comes an amazing database of research. We have at this point over 1 million participants that we can draw on to do various studies. So that's a lot of what we'll be leveraging today in our research. So just quickly, what we're going to be taking you through. We're going to start off with the business case for compassion, not just that interpersonal connection, but also why does this matter organizationally? In the next part, we will be revealing these new research findings, which are really a lot of fun, and actually looking at what the data can tell us about how compassionate leaders are different from their counterparts. And in part 3, we'll be actually getting into the work. Okay, hands-on, let's take this research and bring it into the real world. What can we actually do to coach leaders to develop them to be more compassionate? And number 4, hey, if this were easy, we wouldn't need to be here. So there are roadblocks to this, right? We're going to be looking at those roadblocks. What are they? How do we get over them to pave a smoother path for compassionate leadership? And you can see where we'll have those Q&A breaks at the midpoint and then again at the end. So keep those questions coming. So I want to start us off with a poll. It's always really fun to kind of see where people's heads are. So how common do you think compassionate leadership really is? And it's okay to just take your best guess. Do you think the majority of leaders are acting with compassion? Feel like maybe it's half, or is it honestly a pretty rare thing to encounter? I feel like it'll be interesting to see people's perspective on this. We'll give it just a moment for everybody to wake up their fingers and put an answer in. See if we have any consensus.
It's always interesting to look at this, right? The degree to which people sort of feel empathy and feel care versus act with compassion in the leadership role, right? So there's so many different levels around felt versus experienced and where compassion actually shows up. I'm excited to see. It's fun to see all the numbers coming in.
All right, let's share these results. So it is, I guess it's rare to think it's common. So not a lot of people, 2% are saying they feel like the majority of leaders act with compassion. And 57% say maybe it's around half, and 40% of folks say it's quite rare. Well, so we're actually thanks to our research, we're actually going to share what our data can tell us about this. So it'll be fun to see that in just a little bit and see if our consensus was on the money. So let's go on. All right, so we're going to just look at the business case for compassionate leadership. Now, if you're here and you're joining us, you probably see the inherent good in compassionate leadership, I imagine, when you have an interest in this topic, right? We know how much value this has interpersonally, but organizations think about things a little bit differently, right? So let's get into that. I'm going to pop our cameras off so we can really focus. Okay. So employees are people. This is who we work with, right? And people are stressed. And of course, a lot of us observe this anecdotally, but the research bears this out. There's an epidemic of workplace unhappiness. When we look at data from around the world, 2/3 of people don't feel engaged at work. 60% just emotionally detached, and almost 1 in 5 feel miserable at work. That's a heavy feeling to be bringing into the workplace. When we look at the US data, I know a lot of folks are joining us from the US today. Half of people are feeling stressed on a daily basis. These are daily numbers. This is not once in a while, but every day. 41% worried. 1 in 5, again, sad on a daily basis when they talk about their life in the workplace. And again, almost 1 in 5 feeling angry on a daily basis. So this is a little stark. And if you feel like it's been getting worse, again, that's not just anecdotal observation. The data bears that out. In 2023, employee satisfaction was declining rapidly, a rate of 10 times faster than the previous 3 years. Those are pandemic years. That's not saying pre-pandemic and post, but actually even in this late pandemic stage, it's continuing to decline faster and faster. And when we look at Gen Z, now I know there are all kinds of headlines out there and opinions and probably stereotypes of Gen Z workers, but one thing we have to agree on is they're going to be a larger and larger part of the workforce. And 62% are saying that they're dissatisfied at work. That's higher than any other generation. Well, this is our emerging leadership, and this is how they're feeling. So the good news, right, why we're here is that the right leadership actually can make a difference. This is not all doom and gloom. Leaders on a team account for 70% of the variance in team engagement. So the leaders that you coach and the leaders you develop and work with can actually have an impact here. And the flip side of that coin is when we're talking to people who are feeling dissatisfaction, 35% of them are reporting that a lack of trust in the leadership is the main reason for that dissatisfaction. So putting a leader on a more compassionate path really can have an impact. What is a compassionate path, just so we get on the same page and we're all clear about that? So, step 1 is recognizing you need, actually, looking up and seeing what's going on around you and recognizing that other people have needs. Then it's experiencing empathy, so feeling that genuine interest in an actual concern for other people. And then that can bring you to what we're talking about today, engaging in compassionate leadership. That's actually action-based. That's not just a thought or a feeling. It's actually about what you do. And when somebody gets on this path, when we can do that, the benefits are very real. And I think, intuitively, we think, of course, the benefits of compassion on the person who receives it, that they're experiencing a positive experience. And of course they are, right? They feel less anxiety, they feel more valued. This is all wonderful, but it doesn't stop there. The giver of compassion, research shows that they're also having a positive benefit here. They're making more meaningful connections. Their perception of them in the workplace actually improves. And then organizationally, there is research shows that this matters. You see, with more compassion, you see better employee commitment, more openness to ask for help, which is a huge factor in avoiding burnout. Organization-wide resilience and pride. So these are big impacts. This is not small stuff. It's not just about two people's relationship. It's actually much bigger and really has an organizational impact. So as people who work with leaders, what do we do about that? I'm going to hand things over to Maria so she can talk to us about the research.
Thank you so much, Lucy. So, as Lucy has just told us about, there is an absolute need for compassionate leaders. And based on the poll results, I would think that most of you agree, right? This isn't something that's very common. I mean, we'll see what the research says, but at least intuitively, there seems to be a sense that there is a need for developing compassionate leadership. And so we conducted brand new research for this webinar, in large part because we always want to ensure that what we share with you is current and based on contemporary real world data, right? A lot's going on, a lot's been happening. So we want to make sure this really reflects the workplace nowadays. And so for this research, we had a sample size of almost 6,000 leaders, and 71% were at the department manager level or higher. So, leaders and managers in the sample for the most part. As you can see, the data were collected from 2021 to 23. So this is after the start of the pandemic, like really, really recent data covering a broad range of industries and countries, right? This is a global study. The gender distribution is what we typically see in our assessment database, but you can see exactly what it is right here. Okay, so how did we conduct the research? The first thing you do in something like this is define what you're measuring, right? We wanted to define compassionate leadership. And it's not compassion in general, right? We're not talking about, the layperson's definition of compassion. This is about how one can use their leadership to demonstrate compassion in an organizational setting. So it's very specific to leadership within an organization. And we operationalized it by using 6 different effectiveness measures or competencies that are related to compassionate leadership: being fair and equitable, being effectively inclusive, creating psychological safety, demonstrating ethical leadership, the ability to develop people, and conflict management. Now, the last 2 on this list may seem like, where did that come from? Well, they make sense in the sense that they apply to compassion in an organizational setting. So the ability to develop people relates to compassion because it involves recognizing what people need and want to learn, and then allowing them to go out and learn it, allowing room for mistakes, for example. And so it involves some showing an appreciation of someone's needs, and facilitating their growth. Conflict management similarly relates to it because it does involve taking action to reduce friction, reduce discomfort between parties. So again, there is an element of recognizing a need and then taking action to reduce the suffering, the discomfort that people are going through. So it is actually compassion, a way that compassion can be expressed in an organizational setting. Now, to be considered a compassionate leader in our research, leaders had to score, here we go, in the top 50th percentile on all 6 of these compassionate leadership competencies. Okay, so that means they were above average, right? Top 50% on all of these. Now, if you're wondering where the competency data come from, they are from the LEA Leadership Impact Questionnaire, which is part of the LEA 360 Observer Questionnaire. And these 32 items included in the Leadership Impact Questionnaire give leaders feedback on how they are performing in a variety of areas related to effective leadership. In our research, we use them to identify leaders who are effective in a subset of areas, as we are doing here. So now that we have a group of high compassion leaders, our next step was to see what sets them apart behaviorally, right? What are they doing different from other leaders? And so to do that, we compared 2 groups of leaders: the high compassion leaders, right? Those who are top 50% on all 6 compassionate leadership competencies, to the other leaders in the sample. So those who are lower on compassion. And we compared them on 22 leadership behaviors. And these are the 22 leadership behaviors measured by the LEA 360. Now, these behaviors are neutral in nature. They're not evaluative. What they do is they describe what a leader is doing as they engage in their day-to-day work. Okay. Now, both the leadership impact competencies and the behaviors are available as report options for the LEA 360, for those of you who are interested. So let's see. So to review and make sure we're all on the same page, remember that, I'm trying to move the slide forward. There we go. Remember that our high compassion leaders were those who scored in the top 50% of these 6 competencies, being fair and equitable, inclusive, creating psychological safety, ethical leadership, developing others, and managing conflict. So what did we find? Let's get to the fun part. What did this new study reveal? So the first thing that we learned, and it's going to answer the poll question, is that compassionate leadership is rare. Okay. You know, we asked you this, and a lot of you got this right, and some of you were close, right? But how rare is it? Well, it turns out that only 15.7% of the leaders in our sample met the definition of a high compassion leader. Okay. So what this tells us is that compassionate leadership isn't something that may come naturally to all leaders. It may require some development, but of course, it is something that can be developed, and that's why we're here today, right? So let's go on to our next big finding. So the next thing that we found was that leaders, high compassion leaders, were more effective. What does that mean? It means that they outscored less compassionate leaders on all LEA effectiveness measures, on all of the LEA leadership impact measures. As you can see right here, longer bars indicate a greater difference between the two groups, but they outscored the less compassionate leaders across all of them. So the LEA Observer Questionnaire asks observers to rate leaders' level of effectiveness on 32 different leadership competencies. 6 of those were used to define compassionate leadership, so that leaves 26 measures. And those measures include effectiveness in the areas of credibility, social skills, cognitive skills, organizational impact, future potential, and others. And high compassion leaders were more effective in all of those measures. Okay. So, and one thing that I really want to point out is if you look down here in the graph at the effect sizes, the differences between the more and the less compassionate leaders were pretty big, right? They, if the bottom 3 are medium effect size, and anything above that is a large effect size. So this means that more than being statistically significant, there is a real world practical significance to these differences, right? It means that we can see these differences in the leaders when we look at high compassion leaders versus other leaders. So to me, and I hope to you, this shows there is a clear advantage to compassionate leadership. So let's move on to our third finding today. What we found was, and remember, we were looking for differences in how leaders were behaving based on how compassionate they were. We found that there's 9 key behaviors that distinguish highly compassionate leaders. Okay. And the value of finding this, of course, is that behaviors can be changed, behaviors can be developed, and leaders can actually learn to convey greater compassion. So what are these 9 key behaviors? So 5 of the behaviors that differentiate high compassion leaders are things they do more of. There are 5 behaviors that compassionate leaders use more frequently than the other leaders in the sample. First of all, they tend to spend more time demonstrating empathy and showing a genuine interest in people, their needs, and their concerns. And of course, this is not surprising because you'll remember from what Lucy shared earlier that empathy is in the path to compassion, right? Before leaders can respond compassionately, they need to feel a genuine interest and concern for others. So not too surprising there. Second, they're spending more time thinking about and seeking to fully understand the broad implications of their decisions, so being more strategic. They're spending more time seeking and listening to input from others and actually adopting some of their ideas. They're placing more emphasis on explaining things clearly and thoroughly and making sure that others are well informed. And finally, they're spending more time in cooperation or helping others and being willing to compromise for the sake of the group. Now, there were 4 behaviors where high compassion leaders tended to show less emphasis. These are behaviors they used less of than the less compassionate leaders. So they seem to spend less time being dominant or forceful and challenging. They spent less time working autonomously and making decisions independently. They were placing less emphasis on very direct feedback and, and making sure that people know exactly where they stand. And finally, they spent less time pushing to achieve, testing limits, and setting ambitious goals. So now that we've shared so much with you, I think it might be time to open the room up for some questions. So, Lucy,
Yes,
let me
absolutely. And
know
we
if we
have
have
so
anything.
much. All right. So we have a lot of great questions coming in, especially clarifiers about the research. So Maria, a clarification on, you talked about the impact report, or we call it sometimes Part B, if you're familiar with it, the LEA 360. Is that a self and 360? Is that observer? Can you describe that? Make sure we're clear on what that questionnaire is.
Thank you. Great question, whoever asked it. So it is right now only an observer questionnaire. The reason for that is we really want leaders to get feedback on how they're perceived, how their effectiveness is perceived. And so it might get a little tricky when you're asking people how effective they are across these 32. There is a self questionnaire does have some self-reflection items, some of which, like self-confidence, mirror some of the items that you have in the observer questionnaire.
And I'm curious, I'm not sure if we ran this yet, but did you see any variance did you look at age at all with the leaders and level of compassion? Any trends in that?
We did nothing really strong, but I'll maybe we'll leave that for the Q&A after the webinar, and we can share those exact findings with you.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about, just to clarify again on the research side, when you're talking about the LEA, are you talking about Part A, Part B when we talk about compassionate leadership? What can you just a quick clarity again on the study?
No, this is great because I can, if you're familiar with MRG's assessments, we talk about Part A, Part B, Part R, all these parts. So Part A is the behavioral portion where observers rate. Well, they don't rate. They let leaders know how they're perceived, what behaviors are emphasizing more and less of. Right. So in the design, we compared leaders based on Part A, right? How are they showing up differently on Part A? In terms of defining high compassion, that's where we use Part B, which is a measure of effectiveness. So that's a more evaluative questionnaire. And so observers are actually rating leaders on how they are performing on those 6 competencies that we related to compassionate leadership.
A couple questions came in, and I know we'll get a little more into those behaviors, but several people were curious about that lower feedback. Do we want to do a little
I think Trisha's going to get into that.
Okay,
I don't want to. Yeah.
I'm just gonna so that it doesn't hang in your mind. So when we'll talk about these individually, but of course, as you know, we're never ever showing one behavior at a time. And what you can think about, the reason that feedback ends up in that potentially overused space is probably 3 different combinations. So if you're emphasizing feedback while you're de-emphasizing empathy, the feedback ends up harsh and sharp and hard to take in. If you're emphasizing feedback at the same time you're emphasizing dominant, it can come out again as extra forceful and sort of combative. And if you are overemphasizing feedback and underemphasizing communication, then often feedback ends up being a surprise because the communication up front wasn't clear. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more. But when you think about these, we're going to dive into them individually, but they travel together. And that's oftentimes what makes a behavior become more or less critical in terms of success.
Thanks. Yeah, that one had enough little pop-ups in the Q&A that I wanted to make sure we spoke to it, because you could tell that really had people scratching their heads. A couple more just quick clarifiers. When you revealed those behaviors, were those ranked in order of importance? Or...
They actually were, yeah, in order of effect size, so how different the groups were.
And when you
Absolutely.
say compassionate leaders do these things less, are you saying they are highly compassionate leaders currently do them less, or is that a recommendation that they should do them less?
Well, that would be, again, getting into what Trish is going to talk about next. What the actual research reveals is that in that sample of leaders, they are doing it less. How you use that finding to coach leaders to be more compassionate is what you're about to find out when Tricia starts giving us some coaching advice. Yeah, drum roll.
Another great question. So do you think that a leader that's a little less compassionate but more results oriented is more productive in the end? Or do you think that even a high compassion leader, even if they're less result oriented, they're more productive? And I know we were kind of looking at that in those effectiveness measures, but if you want to follow up on that.
Yeah, so I think so based on the effectiveness measures that we just looked at, where the high compassion leaders outscored other leaders across the board, there are measures of productive effect, or production in there. And so you are going to my suspicion is that it's going to be a lot easier to be results oriented when you're showing high compassion, because I mean, that's what the data are telling us right now.
I'll just jump in just quickly. One of the competencies that are measured, and it was on slide 21, was ability to deliver results. And the highly compassionate leaders score higher on that competency than the less compassionate leaders. And I think it's because it's not one person delivering results. It's, if you look at the competencies we use to define what does it mean to act compassionately across the board as a leader, it is galvanizing the whole, right? It's galvanizing others to move forward. And as a result, I think to give that discretionary effort because of that compassionate way of leading, that inclusive way of leading.
Yeah, and we were honestly, surprised that it was across the board. We thought there would be some areas where, the differences wouldn't be that great. So the fact that it included things like cognitive effectiveness, our measures of cognition, and yeah, it was really surprising and nice to see that there is a case for compassion.
A couple more demographic clarifiers. What types of organizations are included in the research?
Oh my gosh, so it's our general database. So all kinds of organizations, all industries, there are humanitarian organizations in there, all sorts of private sector. So pretty much anything and everything is in there.
And were Gen Z included among these leaders? I'm sure some were, but do you have any sense of how much of a chunk that was?
I'm trying to think of they're in there.
I know Maria will. She has the breakdown. Yeah. It's all there.
We can share some demographic breakdowns with you all, but they're in there. 10%, whatever the percentage is in the database, because we're only looking at 2021 to 2023, so they're going to be less diluted than if we used a 5 or 10 year window to look at leadership.
All right, with that, I think we got to a lot of them, which is terrific. A few more coming in, and again, keep them coming because we'll do Q&A again at the end, and we'll make sure you get your answers afterwards. But if we don't get to them during the webinar, one last one that I think segues this very nicely. Has there been a roadmap developed to help leaders become more compassionate or empathetic? What a tee up.
It's coming.
Yeah, so I think with that, we'll close out questions and let Tricia answer that with the next part of our webinar.
All right, here we go. So we're going to talk about the 9 behaviors. For those of you who are familiar with MRG, we anchor our development of leaders in behavior while using insights of competencies to guide us in the research as we have just gone through. So we'll look again. So we've got 9 behaviors total, and we're going to take them one at a time briefly, but also I'm going to share some things thematically that you can think about as coaches. The first thing I want to share, though, is that, 9 behaviors, even 9 out of 22, it is a lot. And so there are 2 things to keep in mind as we're going through this. So Not all 9. You know, when we do research, it's looking at the macro patterns, in this case, across almost 6,000 leaders, right? So it is starting us off on the way forward. The reason that I love the combination of research and coaching is we can get the benefit of these macro insights. But then as coaches, we're really working at that one-on-one level, doing the diagnostic work to understand where that individual is so that we can work with them to chart a very specific path forward. And for each individual, of course, it's not going to require the shifts on all 9. Um, and we're going to see some patterns that where, I'm going to call it a 2-for-1 pattern or a 4-for-1 pattern, where if we guide people for a particular way of being and or thinking, it will be easier for them to make some of these shifts collectively. All right. So I know many of you are know MRG and many of you don't. So again, just a reminder where this data is coming from. We use the LEA 360. It's where our research comes from. As you've heard, it has 2 parts. It has a part where there are 22 behaviors that we measure frequency of behavior. And there is a part where we measure 32 competencies from observer perspectives. Regardless of what you use, I think everybody probably on the call knows if we're using assessments, they need to be psychometrically sound and really helping the individual, the coachee, and helping us actually as coaches in the guiding process. So as I said, we love the research, but then we really want to understand through a good assessment where the individual is. So just a summary about the 360. It is measuring the 22 behaviors from all of 4 perspectives: self, boss, peer, and direct report. And we are focusing on behavior because you can think about the competency of become effective at developing people. Well, when we do research on developing people, that requires 13 different shifts in behavior, right? So if you can actually get down to the behavior level, that's a coachable space. That's where we can really work. And one of the things we've been focusing on for the last 5 years, even pre-pandemic, is how do we help development not be so overwhelming for leaders, that we're not putting them in a state where they always feel like they're in a deficit, where they always feel like the goal to be more effective is a huge stretch. So we like behavior because it chunks up development in, excuse me, I'm hungry, so bite-sized pieces, and lets us really work with people in a way where the way forward is clear and the ability to be successful is near term. Our questionnaire design allows people to respond, as Maria said, not looking at are you good or bad, effective or ineffective. We're really looking at frequency in the use of the behavior, right? So that's why when we talk about research, we talk about the degree to which effective leaders are using something more or using something less. In the way that we are looking at feedback through the lens of this questionnaire, we get really discrete information across scores that go from 5 to 99. So we're really getting a lot of differentiation. Helps us in our research, but as coaches, it really helps us help people slightly increase or decrease behaviors in a manageable way. All right, let's dive in. So one of the first things I want to share is useful around thinking of the shift across all 9. And that is coaching leaders to take a pause before they engage in habitual behavior. So across the 9, the first thing that we can do is increase the leader's ability to pause before they take action. And so there are several things that we can do in that space. The first is, and probably since the beginning of time, people have told people to take a breath. But we now know from a biological perspective that taking a breath calms both the body and the mind. So just as a little kind of brain hack, what we know about breathing in support of getting the brain more focused is when the exhale is longer than the inhale, it creates a stronger sense of calm in brain and body. The next thing we can do is train our coachees to ask themselves open-ended questions. One of the things that we're trying to do when we shift behavior change is get people out of habitual patterns. And so when we ask ourselves open-ended questions, our brain pauses to take a step before a habitual response that allows that space to be more intentional about how the leader wants to move forward. It also works if we train coachees to ask other people open-minded, open-ended questions. What do you think about this? What risks do you see? What are your greatest concerns? What are your ideas? If we had more time and money, how would you pursue this? So having a stock set of open-ended questions that expand the space and let others participate, create space for the shifts in all 9 of those behaviors. Simply letting other people speak first and truly listening also creates that pause, because ultimately what we want them to do is create an affirmation, a mantra, a reinforcing statement that what I'm trying to do is be more compassionate, to be more other focused, to engage people more at a fundamental compassionate level. So let's talk about how we move forward in these 5 where we want to increase these behaviors. Just as a reminder, we keep using the word more in this space. It's not that people who are compassionate are using them all the time. And it's not that people who are less compassionate leaders are never using this. It's really calibrating the degree. One of the things about empathy that I mentioned is that empathy is tricky because most people feel empathy. It's built into our brains to care for other people, to have a caring response. The thing with leadership is, does your empathy extend into the leadership space, and can people see it? So teaching people what an empathetic behavior is, as distinguishing from a felt sense of empathy, is where the key in coaching is. Strategic is interesting in this space because strategic says at a general level, I pause to think ahead. I pause to understand implications. So in the compassionate leadership space, it is pausing to understand, who should I include? What else might people be experiencing? How do we assess the implications on people of moving one way or the other? And again, not just doing it in your head. A compassionate leader shows their strategic thinking and how their thinking is aligned with how I'm considering the implications on others. Consensual is stopping often and early to ask for input. So again, having those questions in the back pocket. What are your thoughts about this? What are your ideas? Where do you see the risks? And do it early enough so that it matters in the way forward and people feel genuinely included. Communication is critical. And what's interesting about this one is, and I saw in one of the questions, it's very noisy right now in the world, right? It's noisy in the media, it's noisy in organizational life. Our inner worlds are very noisy right now. And so the compassionate leader makes time to make sure that their messaging is clear, that it's understood. And often that means repeating the message, which can at one level be so frustrating. But it's sort of a pay me now or pay me later thing. Either at the front end, we're very clear and we are sure that that message has embedded in the other, or we are playing catch up for the rest of the way through the implementation or the process. And finally, cooperation is letting people know when and where you are available to be of assistance, to be helpful, and when and where you're willing to compromise. The compassionate leader is not always available to cooperate, is not always willing to compromise. The compassionate leader makes clarity or is clear around when they can do this work, right? So the more we have clarity in this space around helpfulness, around messaging, around asking for input, around demonstrating empathy, around demonstrating where you're being strategic, it creates that more space for that compassionate leadership. In that do more space, there's 2 themes. The first theme is I'm taking a little bit of time. I am understanding that if I take time now, flowing forward will be easier. And I'm putting others first, not all the time, but making space for a little bit more of putting others first. Let's look at the dial down behaviors. Let's look at where it's not that we're not doing them. We're just being careful of the ratio of where they show up, right? So the first is dominant. That's probably feels obvious. Being mindful of how often you're debating, being forceful, being very assertive. One of the things that's helpful to show our coachees is when you are in a more powerful position, um, defined by your role. I'm X person's manager. Automatically, their brain is geared to see you as more assertive, more forceful, because in their minds, you have more power. So the calibration of dominant has to include how the power that exists in the role that you have. Self is how often you go off on your own, thinking, deciding, working independently, isolating yourself in the work. This is a tricky one because a lot of leaders have independent and individual contributor responsibilities. A lot of leaders in and of themselves can feel overwhelmed. And so the chance to think by themselves, to work by themselves can feel very compelling, to close themselves off so they can feel like they can get something done. So it's not that we don't want to give leaders independent, more isolated space. It's just the balance of how often you're in isolation versus in connection with others. We've talked about the feedback. The issue here is the thoughtfulness in the feedback and what happens if it's overused. It can be too blunt. It can happen without thoughtfulness or empathy. It can happen without enough communication in the front end to have sort of earned your right in the feedback space. So it is not that we want people, compassionate leaders are not low on feedback. They're just balancing feedback more effectively with the other behaviors. And finally, production. Remember what we said is actually compassionate leaders are seen as higher on ability to deliver results than low compassionate leaders. So it's not that the compassionate leaders are not focusing on goals. It's just that they're right sizing the frequency of use of how often they use the focus on production as the lever for delivering results, right? So it's a balance on this is our goal, but how do I get us engaged compassionately towards the goal versus not using production as the hammer to drive the goal. Also a theme in this doing less space. We are dialing down that forceful push, that assertive pushing for production, pushing in the dominance, pushing in the bluntness of our feedback. So we're just dialing down that forceful push. And we're dialing back the me first, which I think, as an aside, I'll put in a plug, and I think all of us as coaches believe in this. There's a space for how does the leader care for themselves at a fundamental level so that when they come into that leadership space, they have energy for others. And so that is, what is their approach to wellness? What is their approach to caring for self? How do they keep themselves grounded and centered in the leadership space? Where is their peer group so that they can let off some steam in the peer group so that they can come into this compassionate leadership space and have enough energy to make space for others? So just a reminder, when we're talking about behavior change at MRG, we're seeing behavior as a dial much more than a light switch. It's not turn this behavior on or turn that behavior off. It is really that finesse of how to understand when you need to use a little bit more of a behavior and when you need to modify down a little bit of behavior. It's subtle work, but the subtle doesn't mean easy, which is why coaching is so critical when we're looking at these important behavior changes.
Oh, thank you, Trisha, for sharing those insights and equipping us with, insights for applying the research findings. So, now that Trisha has shared that with us, we did want to take a little bit of time to talk about potential roadblocks, right? So that when we're working with leaders, we can pave a smooth path for them toward achieving compassion. So let's start with the first roadblock. Let's say you have a leader who wants to be more compassionate and they want to act in a way that supports others and reduces, their suffering, any kind of pain they might be going through. But the leader centers on themselves rather than on the person they are trying to help, right? So how do we topple that? How do we help leaders think about who it is that they're trying to help? So first of all, make sure that leaders aren't assuming what others want. They're not making assumptions about what others might need. There are individual differences, group and cultural differences, things that can impact not just what someone needs, but what someone is comfortable accepting. And it's important to take that into account. It's important for leaders to start with input before they start outputting their compassion. So, before acting on their empathy, leaders should pause. And Tricia talked a lot about pausing. They should pause and take a moment to listen to what the recipient of the act actually needs. And then, of course, it's important for leaders to keep their finger on the pulse. Uh, Compassion is an ongoing exchange, right? And so it's important to keep listening, checking in to see if more help is needed, or to realize when it's time to walk away. You don't need to provide the support anymore. So that's roadblock one. The second roadblock we found is that there's a potential always that leadership doesn't think there is a business case for focusing on compassion, right? In other words, you don't get, or the leader doesn't get organizational buy-in. And we know that development takes time and resources, and organizations may not recognize the value of giving leaders space to develop their compassionate leadership skills, right? It may not, I think, at face value sound like something worthwhile. But remember, you have something that they don't know about. You can leverage the data that we've shared with you in this webinar. You have empirical data on your side to make the case for compassionate leadership. So we encourage you to share the results of this research that show how compassion correlates with greater effectiveness in 26 additional leadership competencies. I mean, that's a lot. And of course, because you signed up for this webinar, you will be receiving a coaching crib sheet with those findings that you can share with clients. The third roadblock has to do with self-awareness. Okay, what we found in this research is that lower compassion leaders tend to score lower on self-awareness. They're not perceived as being as highly self-aware as high compassionate leaders. And we know that self-awareness is, an essential early step in the journey to greater effectiveness, regardless of what you're working on. So the fact that low compassion leaders might be less self-aware of this could show up in different ways. It could present as a leader who is not very compassionate, but is completely unaware of it. Or it could present itself as a leader who wants to be more compassionate, but may not know what behaviors they are putting out there, right? So what it is they need to work on in order to be seen as more compassionate. And so this is where we think that a valid 360 assessment becomes invaluable. It really lets the leader know where they stand in terms of how much compassion they're putting out there and conveying to others, but also how much they're emphasizing the behaviors that we found to be related to compassionate leadership. So I hope you agree with us that compassionate leadership helps everyone. It helps the leader, it helps the recipient of the compassionate act, and it helps the organization. When leaders in an organization model compassionate behavior in a way that others follow, everyone in the organization can benefit. People become less punitive, employee commitment and pride in the organization increases. Organizational resilience goes up. I mean, a lot of good things happen. And with support, coaching and assessment, any leader can develop compassion, making the work better for themselves, their colleagues, and their organization. And isn't that what we all want to hear? We can do this as we work with coaches. So Lucy's going to tell you a little bit more about what to expect after today's webinar.
Yeah, so we have a few more minutes for questions, so continue to drop those in. The slides and recording are on the way later today. We'll also do a blog post wrap up, and we'll have answers to a lot more of your questions that we didn't get to during the hour. We're working on a coaching crib sheet, as Maria mentioned, which is just like a really handy kind of 2-page key findings item. So a lot of ways for you to both take this and share it if you would like to. And also if you put LEA in the Q&A, that was an indicator in case you missed it in the messages, that you might like to try the LEA and get your results. So you're still welcome to do that if you didn't put that in yet, but you'd like to. I know we talked a lot about the LEA assessment. You may not know it. If you want to try it out, just pop LEA in that Q&A, and our team will be following up with you if you did that. I also, if you're SHRM certified, I put that SHRM activity code in the chat, and I'm just about to drop in one more thing, which is a pre-registration link for our next webinar. So let me pop that in the chat as well. You can sign up. We're going to do a very interesting one on blind spots in March, and we would love to have you with us. So from there, we can get back into the questions. Yeah, there's so many good ones. All right. So this touches on something, Maria, that I know you did a little research on, and we didn't quite have time to fit it all in today, but the IDI is our motivational assessment. Some of you might know that. So it measures what drives you, what drains you. Do you have any little bits you might want to share about how the IDI measures relate to compassionate leadership?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Great question. We looked at it. Why we have the data, why not look at it? And we want to know if there are motivational differences that may be driving compassion. And we did find that leaders who are higher on compassion tend to be higher on the dimension of giving, which is getting satisfaction from providing support to others, helping others. Again, not surprising at all. But that was the only one. Okay. And so it makes sense. I mean, and it's good that that showed up. It would, maybe be a little strange if that didn't show up. But because it's only one motivator that differentiates them, it still tells me that anyone can demonstrate compassion regardless of what their motivational profile might look like on the IDI or in general.
I'm curious about this one. What would you consider any potential impacts of compassionate leadership taken too far? Is there a scenario where you see this being like someone's going too far in this direction?
I might take a stab at that one. So if you haven't had a chance to take a peek at our derailer research, we do have and Maria has updated it relatively recently, where we see patterns of behavior, as measured by the LEA, that are really put people at risk, leaders at risk for being less effective. And there isn't an exact match for what we would call an overused compassionate leader, but there is a kind of a lightweight that somebody is not strong, is not sort of sitting in the leadership space and taking the responsibility for making decisions and moving things forward. So you certainly, under the umbrella of compassion, could use some of those behaviors, overuse and underuse, overuse the 5 to move forward, and underuse, as we've talked about. It's not that there aren't times that you need to be forceful. It's not that there aren't times where you need to operate independently. It's not that there aren't times where you need to give very straightforward feedback. And there's not that there are not times that you need to be focused on results. The compassionate leader is not on all 5 at a high level and off on all 4. The compassionate leader has calibrated those 9 behaviors in a way that's more effective than the other, what are we saying, 82.3% of the leaders who are on the lower half of the effectiveness scale. So I think that's the thing that we really have to bring in as coaches. It's the calibration that makes the difference. It's not the absence or presence of these behaviors. So I think if somebody overused those behaviors, or underuse the 4, they wouldn't make it into the compassionate leader space. They wouldn't be effective in the competencies that we identified as the manifestation of the compassionate leader. So it really is. And that's, again, you know, I know I'm a broken record here. It's why I think coaching is so critical. I really think leadership development done at a group level is critical at one level. It creates community, it creates dialogue. But because development from moderately effective to more effective is such a nuanced place, it's so critical to have a coach in that guiding space. Anyway, as you guys know, a little excited.
So with that, I do want to make sure people have time to get to their next meeting. We have a lot of more great questions, but we will get to any that we didn't get to during the hour. We'll make sure that we get to you afterwards. Let's see what else we want to share. I did put that pre-registration link. So if you want to get into our next free webinar, please join us in March. That's going to be a really good one. Put LEA in the chat if you haven't yet, or in the Q&A if you would like to try the assessment. Our certifications are coming up. Our next LEA certification is coming up in February. And then we have them throughout the year. Our whole year is actually already scheduled, so you can find those on mrg.com. And with that, I'm going to thank you all so much for joining us. And we had a great time and amazing dialogue and amazing questions. So we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.